Welcome back to The Joy of Vinyl. I'm Rick Coste. Now here's one for you. If I presented you with a choice to buy one of these, which would you pick? Now, I'll be curious to hear why you picked one over the other, because it really might be a good idea to pick both. And why? Well, they're kind of two different albums. And there are many folks who would say that the mono version is far superior to the stereo version. Now, why would that be the case? We hear in stereo, right? We have two channels of input. So it does make sense that the music, especially music that's as involved and complex as Sgt. Pepper's, with sound effects and psychedelic leanings, you would almost think that that was meant to be heard in stereo. But that assumption is wrong. The mono versus stereo debate has been going on for easily 50 years, but probably more, especially when it involves albums that were originally pressed in mono and later released in stereo. In some cases, right on the heels of the mono version, they just couldn't wait. Some classic examples of this, aside from Sgt. Pepper's that we just looked at, are Jefferson Airplane's Surrealistic Pillow, Dylan's Blonde on Blonde, and Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. And that's because mono was the format record companies focused on back then. Mono had been around a hell of a lot longer. Everything was mono for decades when it came to sound reproduction. And this dated all the way back to Thomas Edison and his cylinders. Stereo was played around with some success, but it really took a lot of planning. It took a lot of effort in those early years and a lot of manipulation of the technology. One of the earliest known stereo recordings is 1932's Prometheus Poem of Fire. Just give that one a listen. Disney's Fantasia is a famous example of an early experiment with stereophonic sound, and that was in 1940. 12 years later, in 52, the audio engineer Emery Cook dived into stereo sound by cutting a record with two separate channels right next to each other, one for the left and one for the right. But to play it, you needed a unit with two tone arms, separate tone arms with separate needles and a dedicated amplifiers, one for each, as well as speakers. So a lot went into that. It would prove to be too expensive to produce and market too. So record companies tried something different. Why not trick the ear into thinking it was listening to something in stereo? This is where duophonic or fake stereo comes in. Now, I have an early example of Elvis Presley's first record using this method, and it's basically taking the original mono sound, splitting it into two, and manipulating it by using stereo tricks or studio tricks. And this could involve delaying one of the channels a microsecond behind the other, and then applying reverb effects or low-pass filters to alter the sound, giving the impression that you were hearing a stereophonic sound reproduction. In some cases, this was successfully done. In others, it maybe not so much. Let's look at Pet Sounds for a moment. Now, there's probably not many folks who would disagree that the album's a masterpiece. And it was produced at a time when Brian Wilson was experimenting with what was possible with sound and music. He wanted to create something new and something that had never been heard before. And it was a far cry from those early albums like Surf and Safari, which, by the way, also had a duophonic counterpart. But back then, at that time, mono was king in '66 when Pet Sounds was created. Stereo was, as I said, somewhat new on the scene, especially when it came to commercial music. So you would think something as innovative as Pet Sounds would require a stereo mix to play with, but that wasn't the case. Brian Wilson was a genius when it came to mixing and capturing what he wanted to hear, but the thing was, he had trouble hearing out of his right ear. It went back to an early childhood injury. So he favored mono mixes because stereo just wasn't easy for him. And so that's where his energy went into, the mono version. And it was brilliant. Wilson used the studio as an instrument, and it was all mixed in mono. It was one wall of sonic bliss. In the mid-'60s, Stereo was an afterthought. After Brian was done creating his sonic work of art, a stereo mix was produced. The record company, they wanted to spread the individual elements of the music across a soundstage in an attempt to enhance the sound and to also compete with what some of the other record companies were doing at the time and selling. So the result for some listeners reduces the impact of the music and also strays from what Wilson intended. Now, the same can be said for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Both the band and George Martin were heavily involved in the mixing process. The Beatles focused on the mono mix. They spent days, if not weeks, on getting it to where they wanted it to be. And when they were done, the stereo mix was then handed off to other engineers who applied their own techniques and employed their own edits. And some of these edits actually changed how some of the songs sounded. Examples, She's Leaving Home sounds a bit slower with a lower pitch in stereo. Even the use of the flange effect in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds it's altered and a little bit, I'd say, more prominent in the mono version. So you could easily argue that mono version is more historically accurate and more authentic, as that's the one that the Beatles and George Martin intended for the world to hear. Now, of course, as with everything audio, this is all subjective, and different listeners may have different preferences. There's no right or wrong. Some fans prefer the stereo version's wider soundstage and the ability to hear certain details maybe a little more clear, a little more distinct. So, which is better, mono or stereo? Well, it's a bit like asking whether you like your coffee black or with cream. I like mine black. Some folks prefer the spaciousness of stereo. Others love the punch of mono, especially when it comes to recordings that were produced when mono was actually the dominant format. So in the end, whether you prefer mono or stereo will come down to your personal taste and also the specific record that's in question and how it was originally pressed. So what's your take on mono versus stereo? Drop your thoughts in the comments, or you could click the monophonic subscribe button over here. And yes, I said monophonic. It was a really bad joke. Thank you for watching. And until next time, please take care of yourself and enjoy your records.